Welcome back, everyone. Um, I have the pleasure and honor to be welcomed as a panel chair for this session, Illusions of Perspective. My name is Brynjar Eofsson or Perry Mendoza, depending on which illusion of perspective you would want to take. I am a BA student at the University of Iceland's Department of Icelandic and Comparative Cultural Studies, and will soon be a master's student at the University of Helsinki studying literature. Um, I'm writing my thesis with the help of Birta Bjarnadóttir on Sion's novel Rakarbisnir, or From the Mouth of the Whale, exploring the powers of the aesthetics of curiosity, as well as the parallax of aesthesis at work in the novel, wherein, amongst other things, the protagonist, Jonas Lærði Pálmason, disputes the poetics of Snorri Sturluson. Other essays in the works include one that looks into the Danish author Rakel Haslund Gjel's novel Alle himlens fugle, or All the Birds of the Sky, through the concepts of loss, poiesis, and decreation, as well as eco-criticism. So enough about myself. Let me now introduce to you my co-panelists. Adam Hansen is a first-year student in the Faculty of Social Work, who has always had an interest in Icelandic history and literature ever since he read Egil Saga during his tenure in the military. Currently looking to apply the concept of the welfare state to ancient Icelandic society, he has a vaunted interest in meshing aspects of the social work profession with the societal slash cultural aspects of Icelandic history. And Dustin Girard teaches in the Icelandic department and the Department of English, Theater, Film, and Media at the University of Manitoba. He has published on medievalism, speculative fiction, and horror literature, and his current research interests include contemporary interpretations of Norse mythology. So we will begin with Adam Hansen, and I give the floor to you, Adam.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. The paper I'm presenting today is entitled Sympathy for a Jotun. Basically, it's an attempt to exonerate Loki's actions, specifically in terms of Baldur's death, using cultural considerations and the ancient laws of medieval Iceland. So before we get into it, and there's a lot to cover, so I'm going to be really quick. I just want to give you a few stanzas from the sayings of the High One, just to give you some context. If you've another whom you don't trust, but from whom you want nothing but good, speak fairly to him, but think falsely. And I think that really explains the mentality of Odin when he swears blood brotherhood with Loki. Obviously, Loki's known as a sorcerer. He's a well-known, powerful. He wants to take that individual and suborn him, take him under his wing, make sure he's not a threat in the advent of Ragnarok. Again, there's that saying from the Oracle, a ship journeys from the east. Most of his troops are coming in Loki steers. So I would argue that's Odinic strategy rather than any sort of kind consideration or attempt to make peace. So make of that what you will. So there's three main points I want to bring up. First of all, the notion of his children, Loki's natural born children. All of them were tormented. Sleipnir, what happens to him? He's basically enslaved by Odin, right? Becomes a mount. There's no consideration of Loki's thoughts or kinship ties or anything of that nature. You look at Hel, she's cast into the underworld. Now, whether that's because she was raised in Jotunheim or it was a xenophobic ideology, that's up for debate. Fenris Wolf, what happens with him? He's raised in Asgard, and as soon as he's possibly a threat, he hasn't done anything, but he's possibly a threat, they bind him and they break their word. And then you have Jormungandr. He's tossed into the sea. Now, I would argue that this is primarily to cut Loki's kinship ties, to dissolve his base of power, if you want to call it that, and make him more reliant or a bondsman to the Aesir and the Vanir. Another point I want to stress, excuse me, and this is in the very beginning almost, when they build the walls of Asgard, All the Vanir and Aesir, they make an agreement with this giant. We're going to provide you with this, that, and Freya to wife. But once it's done, what do? They want to break that oath. They want to kill the giant, but they need a scapegoat. So who do they suggest? Not Thor. Never Thor. Odin can't make a mistake. We'll blame Loki. He's not one of us, technically. Which I find very curious, because in terms of blood brotherhood, essentially, your problems become their problems. Your family becomes their family. And to violate that is to be an oath breaker. And we all know how well that's received in the various sagas and mythology. So ultimately, from that viewpoint, I think it's pretty clear that Loki is not so much given the same platform as the various other deities in the mythos. So let's get to the meat of this. Let's talk about Balder. So we've already established that they've tormented Loki's children. They tortured Fenris Wolf. They've ostracized and done who knows what else to his other children. So it comes as no surprise that he's seeking blood feud. He's seeking revenge. But the one point I want to make out is the Aesir and the Vanir are not capable of retaliating under the law. And I'll explain that in one moment here. Now, first of all, if more than one man were present at a killing, they have to designate one individual to be responsible. That's according to the Gragas. They slew Hoth. They took their vengeance. And to increase this problem by saying, well, okay, we took the man who killed him, now we're going to blame Loki. That seems like a forerunner in every single myth or legend or tale where Loki's involved. We're going to blame Loki. It's Loki's fault. We're not culpable. So if you want to extend that even further, according to the law, it's not murder. He didn't kill Balder. He didn't murder Balder. He killed him, but he didn't murder him. And that's established in the Lokasena, when he admits to killing him in maybe a roundabout way, but essentially he says, yeah, it was me. Specifically when he says, Frigg, you want me to say more about my wicked deeds, for I brought it about that you will never again see Balder ride to the halls. At that point, there should be an instance of restitution. We're guilt. All right, I'll pay for the murder. Fortunately, the Aesir don't see it as such. You know, the old adage of, I don't keep my family in my money purse. And what do? They torment him. They wrap him up in his son's entrails when they've already been culpable. They've already established that they're not seeing this individual as one of their own. So under that premise, it seems glaringly obvious that this wasn't meant as a peace gesture. This whole situation, this whole manipulation of Loki is meant to give them an opportunity or an advantage during the theater of war, which is Ragnarok. So ultimately, I would argue that, not only is he justified in what he does, the Aesir and the Vanir are the guilty party. And I know there's some argument whereas you can't say, these ones are good and these ones are evil, right? I think there's evidence on both sides of compassion and malevolence in both the Jotun and the Aesir and the Vanir. But if you're going to place a legal stricture or a cultural stricture on your people, right? And that's been established through the myths. Keep your oaths, take your vengeance, all these sorts of aspects. It's basically saying, do as I say, but not as I do. And this is nothing new. You look at all the various aspects where they're seeking with Hoth and Balder. Oftentimes it's portrayed as Loki being jealous. He's jealous of Balder, and he's so well loved and all this other sort of stuff. But if you look deeper, he wants vengeance for his sons and his daughters. Ironically enough, one of them, he's a mother to one of his children, not just the father, Sleipnir specifically. So you have to ask yourself, is this either an option of history written by the victors or a true account? I would argue it's history written by the victors, which we've seen throughout modern history. So in summation, I think it's very relevant to take a look at the notion of xenophobia and isolating, I hate to use this term, inferior bloodlines. Case in point, it's okay for a giantess to marry a god, right? But a goddess can't marry a giant. It's impure. It's not considered relevant. And I find that supremely ironic because Thor is half giant. Brother was a giantess, but that's okay because it wasn't the male paradigm. So yeah, that's basically the premise behind my paper. Excuse me. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam, for your interesting talk, and I'm sure that people will have questions for you later. And in the meantime, I would love to send the spotlight over to Dustin. And yes, just
Dustin, you're muted.
Mute. Okay, there we go. All right, sorry. I still have plenty to learn about Zoom. Yeah, so hopefully everyone can see my slides. Okay, so, and I've got share audio on because I have a couple of video clips that I'm going to show. So if you don't hear audio for the video clips, just let me know in the chat right away and I'll restart it. But with that, I guess I will just get started. So, okay, so my talk is going to be kind of informal, and some of the ideas are going to be kind of out there, I guess.
Sorry, Dustin. I hate to interrupt you, but you have a couple boxes on top of your slides. Zoom is like this. You just need to move whatever's in front of the slides.
Oh, okay. Let's see.
There you go.
Okay, that's better now?
There's one at the top. There's basically your Zoom control bar.
Oh, okay. You can. All right. Let's see.
But we can't see it, but it creates a block.
Well, maybe I'll just show this in non-full screen. That might help. Let's see if I can move it out of the way. How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, everything's visible now. The type is visible now at the top.
Okay, good. Well, yeah, I'll just show it in not full screen then, I guess. Yeah, this should work. Okay, so yeah, and also thanks for letting me know, Ryan. That's helpful. Yeah, so I'm just going to rapidly go through a few examples of 20th century and modern interpretations of mythology. And hopefully this will touch on some of the topics we've already discussed in this symposium. So I became interested in this term simulacrum, and I guess it is a post-medieval term in English which refers to an imitation of something, like a representation of it, but like a false representation. So it was used to refer to things like statues of heathen gods or paintings of heathen gods. In other words, something which represents something which is not real. So something which is an illusion in some sense. And I think a lot of contemporary interpretations of mythology have to kind of deal with this. They have to deal, like in Gaiman and so forth, and I'll show the American Gods intro later on. They have to deal with the fact that people don't really believe in heathen deities anymore. Now, there may be some exceptions, but nevertheless, like we are looking back with some skepticism on these stories, and so modern authors who are obviously fascinated with these stories have to come up with some interpretation there. Now, they could just do a literal interpretation or a science fiction interpretation or something, but I think there's also, this sort of simulacrum interpretation that things resembled each other, that there's some kind of higher truth is being channeled or something, or some truth about belief or something like that. So yeah, I'll just start getting through these examples. So the first example is from E.R. Edison. This is from The Worm Ouroboros. So that was one of the cover illustrations on the first slide there of this book from 1922. And Edison is just a wild writer, just really out there, like as I think this example will show. But also, I think the best way to capture how kind of crazy and out there Edison's works are is just to quote the title of this article called "Why Do They Quote Shakespeare on Mercury?" It's a very good question, because supposedly this novel, The Worm Ouroboros, takes place on Mercury. Now, it's not portrayed like scientifically, it's portrayed basically as like another Earth. And Edison's idea seems to be that there's many worlds that are like Earth, or, specifically they're more like the medieval or early modern Earth. There's many different worlds in which similar conflicts and similar patterns arise. And so that's kind of the answer that Brenton Dickinson gives to his question of why do they quote Shakespeare on Mercury? Because, of course, throughout Edison's works, he is drawing on multiple different literary traditions, including Norse ones, in many different complex ways, including directly quoting them, but also in taking inspiration from them. So in this case, I always thought this was kind of a striking moment in The Worm Ouroboros, because one of the camp commanders, one of the military commanders, he seems to receive like a ghostly warning about the next day's battle, and this ghostly apparition, who I say is, I would suggest that this is an Odinic apparition. This mysterious old man in a cloak has somehow infiltrated his military camp, which makes him very angry, and he says, hot stirring heads are too easily entrapped. Hold fast to that which is thine, and beware of Thremnir's hue. So, of course, Odin is associated both with like, the travel and wandering and disguise and infiltration and things like this, but also with like holding on to your home. And so there's the question, what does this warning mean? Is it a trick, basically? Is this, now, just to explain what happens, the next day in this novel, this commander who has received this warning, he does the exact thing he was warned not to do and charges in and gets slaughtered with all of his men. And so the warning is like, you're being played here, like a military trick is being played on you. You're going to be, if you charge in, you're going to be ambushed. And so it seems like it's actually a helpful warning. Maybe this Odinic spirit was actually looking out for him. But interestingly enough, in a world in which the supernatural exists and plays a role even in military affairs, the commander doesn't believe it. So when the old man vanishes immediately, a sub-commander says, the thin habit of spirits is beyond the force of weapons. But the commander doesn't believe it. Was this a spirit? I hold it rather a simulacrum or illusion prepared for us by Witchland's cunning to darken our counsel and shake our resolution. So in other words, he thinks, oh, sure, there's supernatural spirits, but like this is an illusion. This wasn't a true warning from some like ancestral god who's looking out for us. This was like a military trick, basically. And so it's just a really interesting example because the issue of belief and trickery becomes very important in determining the outcome of this battle. And also, I noticed that Edison uses he has a peculiar archaic style, but he says, "Now was Lord Spitfire wood angry." He uses the term wood, and of course, that's part of the root of Onun's name, as I have the quotation there in the bottom left-hand corner, meaning fury. So it's fury is really what undoes him in this battle. He's not strategic enough. He allows fury to take control without a proper amount of strategy to go with it, basically. So that's just an interesting way I wanted to open. And so for the rest of this paper, I will just zip through 3 modern television shows that each do something similar in terms of interpreting what is the place of mythology or the supernatural in a modern story, even if it is a story that takes place in the past. How do these things relate to each other? So the first example I have is a series called Carnival, and this is set during the Great Depression, which the series refers to as the last great age of magic. And so the concept behind this whole series is basically that the testing of the first atomic bomb ended the supernatural, that the supernatural actually was a real force, and supernatural forces intervene in human history and even military history commonly throughout all of history until the nuclear bomb was detonated, at which point, as the creator was quoted as saying, God tossed us the car keys. In other words, like now, once humans gained control over the atom, they took control of the physical universe and their own destiny, and therefore they were no longer under the kind of supernatural chaperoneship of these avatars. But one thing I think is, so this is clearly drawing on a theory of archetypes. That is ultimately the answer to why do they quote Shakespeare and Mercury? It's because Edison has his own theory of archetypes. He has a theory that there's emergent figures or spirits that influence humanity or culture. And so the interesting thing is, I have this quotation from Jung here, who argued that archetypes are not fixed. So just because someone is in the series they're called a creature of light or a creature of darkness, just because they have that role, just because they actually are connected to this supernatural order, it doesn't mean that they are what you think they are. They're still real human beings with real personalities, and they don't necessarily accept their archetypal roles. And so the classic example, I have this quotation here of the person who was the avatar of darkness during the Great War. So you would think would be an incredibly evil person who's responsible for causing the supernatural to influence humanity at an extremely dark time, and yet he says he basically regrets all of it and says he wishes he could make it all stop, but he can't, and no one can. So it's like people are caught in this pattern that's beyond their understanding. So I'll just read the end of the quotation here. This is from the synopsis for the show. The world they thought they knew, this tenuous, prosaic reality shared by humankind, is actually a chessboard upon which is played the ancient conflict between light and darkness. And of course, they are key players in the battle. So I'm just going to try to play the opening credits to this series because I think the opening credits actually do orient viewers in the world and capture this idea of a relationship between a supernatural reality of archetypes and the real world of human history, or the natural, I guess, the human history as we would understand it on the other. So if this doesn't work, well, I'll just give it a shot. So let's tell me if hopefully it's loud enough. Okay, so that I think is kind of it doesn't do enough justice to it to call it the null hypothesis, but the default interpretation, I think, is the Jungian interpretation that mythic figures represent aspects of the subconscious or something like that. So that's, I think, an interpretation that many of us are familiar with. But there's also a couple of other interpretations of how this works. So I'll dive into those now. So we talked about Game of Thrones already. This is the synopsis for Game of Thrones, and this image of artwork from Game of Thrones, I think, captures this idea that, like, it's an alternate. It's inspired by, obviously, medieval history, but it takes place in its own world. It's not necessarily in our world. It doesn't, there is no portal, basically, or not that we know about. There's echoes of medieval history and medieval legend in these various cultures, including the Old Norse culture, but there's not this direct relationship to our reality. So I'll just play the opening credits for Game of Thrones, which I think likewise kind of express this idea of a self-contained, aesthetically medieval reality, and orienting viewers in that world. As for Game of Thrones, I think Game of Thrones clearly follows Tolkien's idea of subcreation. So I'll just read his quotation here. Enchantment produces a secondary world into which both designer and spectator can enter, to the satisfaction of their senses while they are inside. But in its purity, it is artistic in desire and purpose. Magic produces, or pretends to produce, an alteration in the primary world. So the idea of subcreation is it's like the author or the artist, or the whole team of artists, all the people involved, they're making their own little world, and it has to be internally consistent, and it has to have its own rules. And, this is actually an area where I think Game of Thrones ran into trouble, but it has to kind of all fit together. Even if it has supernatural elements, those elements have to have some consistency to them, so that readers or viewers or whatever it is can kind of understand the world from the inside, as it were. And I also wanted to bring up Lord Dunsany, another, I think, very important writer who dealt with some similar ideas, although he didn't actually develop anything like a theory of subcreation like Tolkien did. And yet, nevertheless, like in his very first book, The Gods of Pegana, you see this, wildly sort of creative and somewhat humorous, and somewhat also ironic and detached perspective on creation itself. So I'll just read. These are some words that are said by the gods themselves in Dunsany's subcreated book. And we play with worlds and the sun and life and death until Mana arises to rebuke us, saying, "What do ye, playing with worlds and suns? It is a very serious thing that there be worlds and suns, and yet most withering is the laughter of Mana Yod Sashai. And when he arises from resting at the last and laughs at us for playing with worlds and suns, we will hastily put them behind us, and there shall be worlds no more. So it's kind of like the end of the world, or the end of reality, the end of the universe. It's not with a bang, but with a whimper. It's a sense that this is all just a temporary illusion. It's all the dream of this higher being. So there's this kind of reflexive attitude of subcreation that, like, if you are an artistic creator of some type, or if you're a writer, or if you're working on some kind of artistic project that involves simulating the world, then how do you know that the world that you're in, that doesn't apply to that level too? And so that's why I think there may be some religious or potentially heretical implications for this idea of subcreation. Tolkien certainly seemed to have thought that there could be some potentially troubling religious implications to this idea. But for Dunsany, on the other hand, who seems to have been more of a skeptic, it was totally fine to play with worlds and suns, as long as you realized, like, it wasn't, the implications were more that you should take reality less seriously rather than you should take subcreation more seriously. So I'm conscious of time here, so I'll move on to the next example. So the next example is, of course, Neil Gaiman's American Gods. I'm referring to the TV show here, and I'll show the opening credits of the TV show next. But I have just argued that the previous writers I've been looking at, I think, could be classified as like sort of neo-romantic writers, and I've listed a few other examples of 20th century writers, and and of course, William Morris, a precursor to many of these ideas, I think, in a lot of ways. And Neil Gaiman's take seems to be more like a postmodernist take on a neo-romantic theme. So I had this quotation here which explains how gods are presented in American Gods, particularly the TV series, but also in the novel. And basically the idea is that they're created by belief. The more belief they have, the stronger they are. So that's why I say it's postmodernism, because it's almost like the epistemology. Things become true because you believe them, as opposed to the other way around. So the more people believe in a god, that actually gives the god more power in reality. And the opposition is between these two gods. Odin, who's leading the old gods, who has survived for a very long time and is referred to as an old fraud. Like it kind of implies that his power is to get people to believe in him, and that it's kind of, he sort of bootstraps his way up into a religion, which is an interesting interpretation of the Old Norse religion itself. And then the rival, the leader of the new gods, is called Mr. World, and he's this like figure of globalism that's going to unite the entire world into one economic, political, and military system under his control. And so that's the conflict. It's like the conflict between new and old beliefs. So here is this is the opening credits to American Gods. So as you can see from the introduction there, it uses it embraces anachronism and mixes together images from ancient religions with images of modern technology, and it has this interesting implication that humans have replaced the worship of old gods with the worship of science and technology in a lot of ways. And so I think the best theory to use to interpret this is actually the idea of memes. So this is, the funny thing is, like, Richard Dawkins might not necessarily agree with this. He's the guy that originated this idea of memes, but I've got this quotation here in which he describes it, and the idea is basically just like a unit of cultural information that replicates, and so it captures the idea that, like, a catchy song or something like that will spread widely because it appeals to people's minds. So something that it's not necessarily like inherent the way that an archetype is. It's more like something which can jump. It's basically something that can go viral. It's something that jumps from person to person and gains power the more people believe in it. So yeah, I think this concept of memes really captures the underlying dynamic of American gods. And I have this quotation here from Elon Musk, who, if there is such a thing as a Mr. World, then Elon Musk wouldn't be a bad contender. And he at one point he tweeted this: "Who controls the memes controls the universe." So yeah, I think that kind of explains the framework of American gods. So just to wrap up, I will. So these slides are available. So I won't actually, you can always look through. I'm not going to read everything. You can look through these on your own if you like. But these theories, these three theories, subcreation, archetypes, and memes, have implications for how things actually work in these stories. Like Mr. Wednesday, the old god, is like, planes only fly because people believe they do. Because he comes from this epistemology, apparently at least, where that's how things work. Now, of course, I have this quotation. This happens to be an example that Dawkins has also given, where he argues that everything must fit into a realist frame of physical reality. So things don't become true because you believe them. And a plane, if you can believe a plane will fly or not, but it'll still, that will be determined by the laws of physics, not by your belief. But I do think that there is an interesting way of potentially, I would say all of these theories, I think, are onto something. They all have some value when it comes to interpreting modern versions of mythological stories. And I do think there is some overlap too. And I think the overlap comes from the idea of the mind constructing a model of reality. That's something that they all seem to have in common. And I also would argue that this is something which can actually fit even into Dawkins' argument that everything has to be in a realist frame. You can still, I think there's still a way for this to all, if not be completely compatible, then kind of be getting at the same point. But interestingly enough, in American Gods, though, where things do work based on belief, Mr. World is like, there's only going to be one religion in the entire world, and everyone's going to be worshiping me. That you can pick, and what you can pick is different flavors. They get a choice, of course, but they are buying salsa. In other words, there's this hierarchical economic and technological order that he's going to imply, in which you'll have to believe in some variety of his corporate brand, basically. And outlaws like Mr. Wednesday they're a thing of the past, and they're on the way out. So however we choose to interpret these, I just wanted to end by showing one symbol. So whatever theories we're using, I think you do find a common symbolism throughout many of these stories, both the old versions and the new ones. And so in this case, I just have the symbol of the tree. The symbol of the tree, it occurs in all three of these stories. It's actually a very central and important symbol in all three of them. So yeah, I'm not going to necessarily suggest anything about how we should interpret that, but it does seem to have some level of common meaning, no matter which theory you're using to interpret it. So anyone who's interested in looking at some of the sources or some related readings, this is all listed on this slide. So that's available you can just click the talk title on the schedule. And then I also just included, named after Gaiman's Hall of Forgotten Gods, I included a few fragments that I think, so this first one is the Edison piece the excerpt from Edison that I used, but there's a couple others as well, just a few short pieces that explore this idea of a simulacrum of gods. So I will wrap it up there and close this. There we go. So yeah, thanks for listening, everyone, and yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you both, Adam and Dustin, for these really thought-provoking presentations that are, I would say, very postmodern, deconstructive reinterpretations of perspectives on Old Norse literature and their descendants, basically. And if I may be so abusive with my position as panel chair, I would like to ask the first question to Adam. That basically, with Old Norse mythology being very Aesir centric, did you find in the works that you have been looking into, do you find a strong undercurrent of support for basically the others of this world?
Primarily not. Like a lot of times they're cast off. I don't know how many times I was reading through books and Thor goes and kills thousands of giants and that's it. You know what I mean? That sort of presumption that they're lesser. Obviously, there's exceptions. We've got Loki, all that sort of stuff. But primarily, it's almost like a how do I put this? It's almost like a tally sheet of their victories. If that makes any kind of sense. Like they're aggrandizing themselves. They're sort of putting everybody else, like even the Vanir to a certain extent, are sort of, yeah, those are our second, third cousins. They're around, but look at me, I'm Thor. You know what I mean? So, or I'm Odin. So, to answer your question a bit more clearly, no, I've never really found it to be more supportive of the others in terms of the tales and literature.
Thank you. And now I would open the floor to everyone else. Questions? In the meantime, I suppose I also have a question for Dustin, if I may ask. This idea of simulacrum is very interesting, I find. And how do you see the relationship, this sort of interplay of basically multiple simulacra of reinterpretations of myths through stories, and through stories we go on to books, novels, and then from novels we go into a sort of simulacra itself, the television. How do you see all these, now that we're living in this day and age, how do you see these combination of old and new come into play?
That's a very interesting and I think quite challenging question, because there's so much going on. You know, even you could say even things like just having TV or having radio or having internet now and having the ability to create these elaborate visual simulations of these stories. You know, I have read philosophers that argue that the existence of these technologies inherently undermines our idea of what reality is, or at least changes our idea of what reality is. And you might, you know, some of you might have heard terms like post-truth being tossed around as an assessment of our age, in which it's, you know, or the idea of like fidelity to an original or accuracy, even the idea of an original. Now, I would say, like, do we know what an original text is? Like, do we know what an original source is? Like, at the very least, there are useful and working definitions of those things that have formed the basis of scholarship for a long time. So, like, undermine that at your peril. On the other hand, like, there are some, I think, reasonable questions to be asked about, you know, originality and fidelity. And, you know, Jon Carl Helgeson talks about this in his book, some about the nature of tradition and how it's not necessarily the same as, you know, as a canon. Like, basically, a tradition is not a canon, or a canon can play a role in a tradition, but a canon and a tradition are two different things. So yeah, no, that said, like, it's really hard to say what. I do think there is a kind of epistemological chaos that characterizes our times. So maybe these theories are ways of which the authors have tried to kind of get a hold of that. But it does strike me as very, very interesting that if you look at modern technological societies, they are probably the most like secular and atheistic societies that we know to have ever existed. And yet at the same time, the stories of heathen religions have become more popular than ever in these societies of unbelief. So again, one of the things I liked about Edison's example is it's kind of like, even if you want the gods to go away, they're still there. Even if they don't fit into your epistemology, they're still there somehow. There's still an image of them that you can't get rid of, or something like that.
Thank you. And Ryan has a question for Dustin.
Yeah, well, I can't help thinking that you're taking off from our conversation about the Odinic motif a lot. And while you were talking about archetypes, which I talk a lot about Jungian archetypes sometimes in this sort of mode, you were talking about the null hypothesis. I'd like you to elaborate on what you meant by the null hypothesis in relation to archetypes.
Right. Yeah. Good point. So yeah, I absolutely think that. So Ryan's chapter in the book is called The Odinic Motif, and it covers some examples of Odinic scenes. And I do think that this Odinic motif idea could absolutely apply to the scene from Edison where this Odinic figure appears. I think it absolutely would cover and help explain that. But by null hypothesis, I just meant that, like, because you could say that ideas of archetypes go all the way back to William Blake in the late 18th century. So I just think that the idea of archetypes as an interpretation of mythic traditions is more established than the idea of memes, which is quite recent, or the idea of subcreation, which is, I'd say more of a 20th century idea. So basically, the archetypes theory is probably the one that's most established and has had the longest to kind of percolate through scholarship as a way of interpreting these things.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ryan. We have plenty of time. I think about 20 minutes.
Hi, I have a question for Dustin.
Please.
Mention of postmodernism is really interesting because postmodernism, at least in the view of one of its chief architects, Michel Foucault, is the relationship between power and language, or more specifically, discourse. Whereas Norse culture is infused with this idea of power as brutally exercised, whereas with Foucault, it is covertly exercised. I'm wondering if how the examples that you've given situate themselves between this medieval idea of brute exercise of power and the postmodern idea of covert, unseen exercise of power.
Yeah, great question. So I can't guarantee that my answer will be all that good, but it is very interesting. And I think, because it's a complicated and, the topic may be beyond my expertise, but I do think that one of the things that seems to make the difference is in the medieval sources, like in the Old Norse mythical texts and so forth, there seems to be a clear belief that language itself has supernatural significance. The meat of poetry, myth, and so forth. But there's lots and lots of examples, especially words that are spoken poetically or chanted or that encompass traditional wisdom, that these words capture truth and knowledge and power that is real. So it's not just like you're not when you can actually speak a spell, or you can actually curse someone. You can actually modify the circumstances of reality simply by speaking or performing words in a certain way. So that seems to be, I'm not sure if you would call that like an essentialist view of language, because obviously they still thought there's plenty of language that doesn't have that power, but at least language has the capacity to actually capture and shape, and it has real power, supernatural power potentially, and a real connection to deities or a connection to other folk hero or culture hero figures that are said to have created it. Whereas the postmodern view, it seems to be more like, yes, this encodes a whole bunch of cultural assumptions that we find problematic, but it's just a bunch of noises and signals and signs on pages or on a screen. It doesn't actually have any objective meaning. All it is it's more like projection. Like the users of language are just projecting their own sort of views, but it doesn't. But their language can't actually capture reality, much less manipulate it. They can manipulate perception. They can project what they think is true, but that doesn't actually, like, you know, maybe post. It seems hard to imagine that a postmodernist philosopher would actually believe in magic spells. Although maybe, you know, maybe I shouldn't rule that out.
Well, I think that the difference there is that the language as exercised by an individual will versus language as unconsciously perceived by an entire society is probably the difference there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly seems very accurate to like a sociological sort of view of language, or, you know, language as an environment rather than like a tool, maybe, or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I find, if I may comment as well, I do find this very, very interesting, this sort of maybe ownership of archetypes of language, and this both perhaps Dustin and Adam could comment if they wish to do so. Just this ownership of yes, archetypes, stories, and language, and how we can just deconstruct basically what's presented in front of us, and almost I feel like there's this sort of individualization of this ownership that there's a step in modernism towards the fact that we can do this type of deconstruction of stories and make our own worlds from what people had perhaps back then, what they used to have as just ritualistic repetitions of these stories. So
Adam,
yeah.
would you like to start?
Yeah, I'll give her a go.
Okay.
Excuse me. So in terms of deconstructing stories, I think it's very important to note that one's own experiences and one's own perception of things certainly colors how you interpret a story. In my case, and I blame Dustin for this, but the whole notion of Odinic strategy, specifically when it comes to Loki, I put that in perspective with my own military service. And the first thing you want to do when you're fighting somebody is cut the head off the snake, right? And the body will flounder. Because Loki is such a integral and powerful example of the Jotun, it came to no surprise to me that this approach by Odin was a strategic one, as opposed to some sort of, lackluster attempt at peace. So that's how it colored my perception of the story, and that's what sort of preempted what I wrote. So yeah, I think primarily in terms of deconstructing stories that have been established for centuries and decades, or even a few years, it has to do with how you perceive the world around you, and that'll inevitably color how you interpret a story that is centuries old.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a common factor there too is whatever epistemology you're using to try to figure out what the relationship between the mind and reality is. A common theme that seems to be established in both the medieval sources and modern reinterpretations is language as a weapon. Language is a way that one group takes power over another group, or one person builds themselves up or tears another one down. I think there's a Old Norse poem which is just a list of all the giants that Thor has killed. So it's like building them up and so forth. So yeah, I think that's absolutely a key concept. And I see in the chat as well the idea of the troll has been brought up, which I think is very important, because the idea of the troll, it's like it seems to like invert. It invert concepts of reality, even, or undermine it doesn't just reverse it, but you might even say that it's kind of the concept of the troll is almost like a simulacrum, because it seems to be an illusion in some way, or that it undermines what people understand to be real, or it's outside of what they understand to be real, or something like that.
Ottoman, yes.
I feel a bit provoked here now that trolls have been mentioned. Yeah, the idea of a troll is as a simulacrum is very interesting, but so is your whole theory. So I'm looking forward to read it. But you know, I would say maybe trollishness is not necessarily, you know, it's not necessarily a person. It could be a part of a person, like trollish. So you know, my whole theory about trolls is to fight the idea that trolls are specific people, like that they are necessarily that the same person is a troll always. So it's possible, and you know, the word bitless indicates that you can move out and move in again. So that's like, you know, but that does not necessarily counter what you said. It may even support it.
Yeah, it seems like it could be compatible. The idea that a troll is what is outside of, you know, what makes sense according to the worldview that those who are perceiving it have. So if a person is behaving in a way that's consistent with what others expect to be possible and reasonable, then they're not a troll. But then if they start performing some forbidden rituals and gain abilities that people are not supposed to have, well, then they may have entered the troll category. Or just, you know, supernatural events, as you point out in the troll inside you. Many, it doesn't just have to be a being. It could be like an event or an omen or something. So, or an unusual animal, or just something unusual, I guess.
Yes, I do like this concept of trolls being almost postmodernist, that they reflect the individual's belief system in a way. So that's I think I find that very interesting. And yes, if anyone would like to add any more comments and or questions, we still have time, I believe. Otherwise, I would like to thank again both Dustin and Adam, and everyone for listening to our panel. And it seems to be lunchtime in Winnipeg and about dinner time in Iceland and the UK. So I guess we'll have more than enough time to take a bit of a break and meet back at 1 o'clock Winnipeg time and 7 o'clock Icelandic and British time. Thank you.